Okay, so let's jump into the demonstration for today. Okay, so for those of you that haven't seen Codebeamer, so Codebeamer, like I mentioned, is a web-based application. So run just through your browser, whether we're talking Edge, Firefox, Chrome. Currently, I've loaded in my medical software engineering template. And what this does is it's pre-configured to meet the specific needs of this particular industry, okay? So what comes with it is an out-of-the-box wiki space, which will document maybe the overall purpose and goal, whether we're looking for UMDR compliance or US FDA regulations. It will also document things like the overall change management. Okay, so that process is outlined, everything from the specific roles, as well as the given change tasks associated with these pre-configured processes. Okay, so while this comes shipped out of the box with an appropriate standard or template, everything you see in Codebeamer is configurable in some shape or form, so you can modify it to suit your own needs or your organization's needs. If we jump over to our members tab, we can also see how roles and users are managed within the system. So Codebeamer allows drag and drop functionality into some of the out-of-the-box roles. We can also create our own roles in order to define certain permissions or certain use cases or scenarios, okay? These members can be created directly inside of Codebeamer or pulled through from Active Directory. Okay, so jumping over to our trackers. Trackers in Codebeamer terminology is essentially a way of classifying information. So we're talking about how we might separate out different requirements into things like our user system requirements, software requirements. We have things like our overall design control and project management, which is a way of managing different versions of a project, okay, and its subsequent documentation. Being the medical device field, we have an out-of-the-box standards and regulations tracker. Okay, so what this does is it allows us to show compliance has been met based on a given standard. Okay, so there's no point creating a user requirement, but from an audited perspective, we want to ensure that that user requirement is directly tied to a particular standard that is used within that industry. And here we can see things like additional information relating to the medical device and the risk management associated with it. To better understand how multiple trackers interrelate with one another, Codebeamer allows you to use a configuration diagram. So the configuration diagram is essentially designed to pull in relevant trackers and give you an understanding of how one might influence another. Okay, so if we take software requirements, for example, we can see how underlying software architecture might influence it and how in turn this would influence the overall system requirements. Likewise, we can do it for the system requirements, and we can see how both the software and system architecture might impact it and how it might influence the overarching user requirements. So it's very handy to see as a whole the traceability within the system. Jumping into our specific user requirements, we see the first sort of example of how authoring inside of Codebeamer might look like. You'll have familiar cascading options over on the left-hand side. Okay, so our structure can be divided up into different categories or groupings, whether we're looking at sales and marketing, design, or production. We can also expand this out to see the underlying requirements. Okay. Once again, we have the ability to view that information as a whole, both using text and rich text fields. We can also look at those applicable standards, okay, that have been associated to each requirement, giving us that full traceability. Okay. Down here, we also see the extended downstream and upstream references. So users have the ability to quick and easily edit each item within their space. Codebeamer also leverages the concept of working sets and branches or variants. Okay, so we can effectively use this to explore different design options and different design paths. So individuals, especially within a collaborative environment, can go ahead and explore different ideas and then choose to propagate this information directly from the variant or from the main branch. Okay. So creating new items within Codebeamer is quick and easy. The ability to create new requirements that define a new item that we want to investigate. And add that to our list, okay? So drag and drop functionality allows us to essentially reorder where in this structure each object is placed, as well as the ability to add comments for review purposes or continuous improvement, okay? Just as we saw before, I can easily add in new standards, whether it's one or multiple items from this list. And this has a way of then closing that full circle and making sure that we're actually fulfilling the particular need of this requirement and closing it out as part of our requirements analysis. Okay. Codebeamer also leverages library information, so that ability to reuse existing content within the system without having to manually go and recreate or duplicate items. Okay. So from here, same drag and drop functionality allows us to quick and easily bind particular traces, and once again, have an overall summary of those references. So what happens in scenarios where the requirements aren't fully fulfilled or aren't able to be filled by the requirement, a downstream or upstream requirement itself, okay? So here we have Windchill, okay? So for those of you that haven't seen it, this is PTC's project lifecycle management tool. And essentially we're using this to design our glucose meter, okay? So we might have a particular item in there that we would generate a trace to, okay? So this is a way of essentially defining the underlying requirement, okay? So okay, so once I've established that requirement, we're effectively creating a trace directly from Codebeamer to Windchill, saying that for anyone working on this particular object, whether it's the CAD or it's the information related to it, we make sure that we understand we have an overarching user requirement, potentially from the customer or from maybe the R&D department that's instigating this change, and it's outlining what we need to consider, okay, from a requirements perspective. As a user, I can easily jump into Codebeamer and get a greater understanding of what that information entails, okay? And as a Codebeamer user, I can once again just dump directly into that Windchill object itself to display the relevant information, okay? So users within Codebeamer can easily create new downstream references as a way of evaluating their requirements analysis, as well as showing additional downstream and upstream references, okay? But what happens when we want to conduct maybe a traceability report, okay? So Codebeamer has that capability where we essentially define the various levels that we're interested in, seeing how maybe our overall user requirement would impact our system requirements and so forth, okay? So you can see that there's a wide variety of trackers available to us across multiple different projects, which we can select and add to our system. We can also add multiple levels to really build up quite a complex structures, including additional filters and parameters, okay? For the sake of my demonstration, I've gone ahead and created a template that I'm going to reuse, okay? And here we can easily see our traceability report. So we can understand quick and easily how user requirements impact the system requirements and thus the system architecture. We can also see the gaps in our system and where additional efforts might be required in order to conduct or close out our requirements analysis. We can also pull through suspected requirements and identify any changes that need to be made and pull through those changes. Okay, so we can pull through them individually or as a whole. Okay. So once we've conducted our user requirements, we've defined them, we might want to understand the risks associated with them. So once again, we can use things like a configuration diagram to identify how risks are handled within Codebeamer. So starting off with the initial risk analysis evaluation, we might basically relate these to corresponding hazards, harms, and hazardous situations. Okay, so these within maybe a medical device ideology will basically be a standalone tracker where we can have a repository of information that's used across multiple different projects. Okay, from there we can impose certain risk controls as well as mitigations, okay, so to minimize those risks. So while this traceability shows a software-based approach, this can also be expanded to electrical and mechanical systems, okay? So viewing the risk analysis itself, we have a familiar sort of tabular approach to it, where users can easily create new risks to analyze. The hazards, the harms, and situations are all pulling from the tracker themselves, where users can easily switch between and reuse information, okay? Pre-configured drop-down menus are also there to allow you to quick and easily define things like probability and severities, all of which is configurable and can be adjusted to suit specific needs. This information can easily be represented in familiar formats, such as a risk matrix diagram, where we can understand how our analysis is displayed or organized in terms of our relevant scale. Okay, so we can easily see and pick out certain objects to then view in greater detail. We can also look at our risk after mitigation, and here we can see that we haven't done a very good job at mitigating those risks, but we can also then go and modify that in future. Okay. So once we've gone ahead, we've conducted our risk analysis, we might jump over to our system requirements and have a look at how we might carry out not only the acceptance of these system requirements, but the corresponding test information. So if I jump to a particular object, we can see the status, okay? So the status is related to the lifecycle state or the workflow that is related to every single one of these requirements you see. Codebeamer uses color coding information to easily differentiate between different requirements and the corresponding state. The workflow diagram also outlines how this information is shown. Okay, so we can see the available transitions from reopen to in progress, and then transitioning to maybe awaiting for approval and the acceptance or rejected paths. Okay, so to perform this, we need to firstly define things like a reviewer. So in this case, I'm going to use Pat, who's just my local user, but realistically, this would be a user with elevated privileges, maybe a project manager or a reviewer specifically, or it could be a group of individuals, okay? From there, we have the ability to easily transition between multiple different states, okay? And perform our reviews. So the review purpose is essentially a way of tracking who has performed that acceptance of a particular requirement. So from traceability and audit perspectives, we have the ability to not only review which items have been accepted, but we can also jump into the requirement itself and we can review those changes and who it was performed by. Okay, so giving you that full traceability, whether you need to disclose that from auditing perspective. Okay. So once a particular system requirement is accepted, we can then go ahead and generate the corresponding test case and system validation document. Okay, so to have a look at that, we'll jump over into our test coverage and get a better understanding of how test results are documented and managed inside of Codebeamer. Okay, so firstly here we can see we have some standalone search criteria which will outline the information we're looking at, but more importantly, the test coverage matrix that you see as shown. Okay, so this is going to cover everything from incomplete to not covered items, as well as those that have passed or failed. We also have the ability to dig a little deeper and kind of understand the initial system requirement the corresponding validation protocol, and the test run that was performed. Information such as when it was run, the particular individual that performed that test are all documented, as well as whether it passed or failed. Okay, so jumping into a particular test run, we have additional information about that particular use case. Okay, so we can see the corresponding steps or actions that have taken place and the corresponding result. Okay, so who it was run by and when it was actually performed. In this particular case, we see that a bug was reported with our particular test run, which we can jump into and investigate further. Okay, so we can see things like a priority level, which may signify when certain bugs need to be rectified or how soon they should be rectified on our priority list. We can also see the corresponding test steps, the expected result and the actual result, meaning that users can recreate and hopefully recreate this particular scenario in order to perform continuous improvement. Okay. From this particular bug, we can also perform an impact analysis. Okay, so this is a good way of identifying how we might respond to a particular bug, depending on the severity or depending on how many items it impacts upstream. Okay, so viewing my impact analysis, we can see how the initial bug is related to that validation protocol, and thus are system requirements and user requirements. So this list, as we can see, is quite large, so we may want to action it straight away. Okay, so jumping back into my particular bug, I can use Codebeamer's agile development methodology to effectively work through certain processes relating to our plan. Okay, so we can allocate multiple items to individual sprint lengths and assign it to certain individuals. Okay, so you can see here I have a range of different items ranging from FMEAs to downstream requirements. Once I've allocated the chosen objects that I want to work on, I can essentially move over to my Kanban board and I can start actioning some of these items. So you can see here that Codebeamer allows you to essentially distribute the relevant object into the associated field, whether we're working on it currently, we're verifying it, or we want to close it out. Okay. So that's the end for the Codebeamer demonstration for today.